Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am on South Molton Street in London. And behind me you can see the building where Ernest Bevin lived at number 8. So, fine looking Victorian red brick building. I wonder if the colour contrast is it not great? Is it too great? Is it not great enough? But anyway, he was born, how about if I put it really dark? See a bit better like that? He was born in southwest England in 1881, and he was born outside of marriage at a time when that was a very considerable disadvantage and he was stigmatized. He never met his father. So he grew up in a working class family. He left school at the age of 12, as was the norm back then, and did various odd jobs, being a barrow boy and things like that. Moved to Bristol, which is not far away from his birthplace, in his late teens. And did various jobs there, joined the trades union movement and rose up the ranks. He was also a Christian. Well, almost everybody here was a Christian in those days. About 1% of the population was Jewish. There was almost nobody else in the 19th century. Very few Hindus or Muslims and so forth. And he was of the Protestant denomination. He joined one of the nonconformist churches. I don't recall whether it's Congregationalist or Baptist or whatever, and he became a lay preacher, as in not a minister, not a full-time religious leader, but just an ordinary churchgoer with oratorical abilities who would sometimes speak from the pulpit. And this is where he honed his natural gifts as a rhetor. So the trades union movement led him into the Labour Party. He didn't fight in the First World War. He's involved in some trades union, some restricted occupation, as in the idea who's more used to the war effort staying at home than going to risk life and limb on the battlefield. And by the 1920s, he's certainly very well known in southwest England within Labour circles, and later got himself elected to Parliament. He always had a very thick West Country accent. It was impenetrable to some people, but was one of the best known and best liked figures on the Labour benches, although he had his enemies. You know, achievement begets envy. And a recognisable figure, partly because of his Olympian girth. So 1940, a coalition government was formed. So Churchill was Prime Minister and brought Labour into the cabinet, and so Bevin soon had a position in the cabinet, creating some Bevin boys, as in teenagers who, in lieu of military service, would go down the coal mines and shift coal. By the end of the war, the United Kingdom had over 1 million coal miners. It's difficult to appreciate now just how crucial coal was to the economy back then. We used coal more than we did oil. All right, ships were using oil, and yes, there were cars and trucks, but very few privately owned cars in the 1940s. So domestic heating was usually by coal fire, occasionally timber, because we didn't have radiators, and then factories were run on coal, trains were run on coal. There was still a few ships which hadn't switched over to oil. So, and so power stations likewise run by coal, and more people were getting electricity. So it wasn't so high-tech coal in those days, and obviously one couldn't import coal very easily when U-boats were sinking or merchant shipping that they could. And so he was very well appreciated even by people who were of a conservative or a liberal cast of mind. Victory Day 1945. Okay, so it was just before midnight on the 8th of May when the instrument of surrender was signed in Germany, but obviously the news broke here on the morning of the 9th of May, and obviously Churchill announced it on the radio, and there's a famous clip, you can see it on YouTube, of Churchill on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, and he's addressing the rapturous throng beneath. This is your victory, the victory of every man and every woman, and so it goes on. And Bevin is right beside him, and at the end, Bevin says, 3 cheers for victory, hip hip, hooray, to the crowd like that. So, was he stealing the moment? Well, it was never going to come again, and given that he didn't have many years to live, I'm very glad for him that he did. Perhaps steal a little bit of the limelight. It wasn't just Churchill's moment, it was that of the moment of every man and woman. Well, that would include Ernest Bevin. I find it hard to dislike him, even though he was a socialist. He was a sentimental imperialist. He considered himself patriotic. Didn't think the First World War had been worth fighting, but thought the Second World War was a very moral cause. So he became Foreign Secretary. In July 1945, the Labour Party under Clement Attlee won the election handily. So the first time there was a Labour majority government, and they set out to transform the country, grant independence to India as soon as practicable, for example. So although Bevin consented to Indian independence, he didn't believe that other colonies should be granted independence at that stage. I don't recall who said it at the Labour conference in the late 40s that giving independence to some of the colonies would be like giving a 10-year-old child a key, a gun and a bottle of scotch or something like that. So he also believed that the United Kingdom wanted to develop nuclear weapons. Remember, the nuclear age had begun just shortly beforehand in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the United States had detonated a nuclear bomb for the very first time, and then indeed had visited on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and then the 9th of January 1945. So the Australian, Canadian and British scientists had done much of the spade work to develop nuclear arms. The United States didn't want to share this technology once they perfected it. Obviously, the Americans had taken over all this, the Manhattan Project, and provided most of the money, and the latter stages it was solely American. So the UK decided that it must have nuclear weapons. Somewhat controversial view within the Labour Party just because of the sheer cost of it. There wasn't seen to be a moral aspect to it at the time. 60 million people had just been killed. These bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what difference did another 100,000 lives make? It seems callous, but that was largely the view at the time. Conventional bombings can kill tens of thousands of people a night in some cases, so this didn't stand out as uniquely horrific. So that was him, but he was in failing health by the late 1940s when he was made Lord Privy Seal, as equipped neither a lord nor a privy nor a seal. So he was a man without so many vices, though he certainly ate plenty and he smoked cigars. He didn't feel one bit guilty about that, had no upper class ancestors to live down, but he was happily married, he had several children, and he wasn't a beggar for the bottle. He paid tribute to Ellen Wilkinson, the first woman to become a Labour MP, who died very prematurely, shortly before him, and then he died in 1951. Well, he's the subject of laudatory biographies in recent years, and he had to manage the UK's foreign relations at a very challenging time, a lot of mopping up on conflicts after the Second World War, as there had been after the First World War. So, partition of India, Indian independence, there was a whole Palestine issue. The UK had the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. In 1939, the UK had declared its intention to withdraw within 10 years. It withdrew after 9 years. So putting the issue to the United Nations about the partition of Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, and Zionists lobbying for more land for them, for illegal immigrants to be allowed to stay. Many people were Holocaust survivors, unsurprisingly. They had no wish to go back to Europe. And the United States coming down on the side of the Zionist movement, and the UK not wanting to aggravate Arab opinion too much in Palestine or more broadly amongst the Ishmaelite world. There were the beginnings of the Cold War, that was in the offing. There were so many tricky issues to handle, like refugees, German and other nationalities, and how about the Soviets who'd served the Third Reich, should they be sent back to face the music? And usually they were, summarily executed, or spend years and years in a slave labor camp and things like that. These new governments that were being created in Eastern Europe, recognizing them or not? Well, they did recognize them. The whole Korean conflict broke out under his watch, June 1950. Of course, the UK didn't have very much to do with it, but should the UK dispatch troops to carry out this UN mission? Well, it should. Otherwise, the UN would be a dead letter more or less as soon as it started, like the League of Nations, be neutered. There were other things like the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift from 1948 into 1949. So it was an exceptionally testing period for him to be Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary, but I think it's always widely agreed that he carried it off with aplomb. Didn't always get it right, but he couldn't have been much more successful than he was, especially considering the UK was living in straitened circumstances, was much diminished by the cost of victory, and was facing challenges such as it hadn't faced in peacetime for many a decade. All right, that's enough about Ernest Bevin. So please be generous and donate to me on PayPal or Patreon. Otherwise, I won't be able to keep this channel going. GeorgeCallahan79@gmail.com. You can also book online lessons with me in English, history, religious studies, politics and government, French for GCSE, A-level, International Baccalaureate, 7+, all the way up. I teach adults as well, teach business executives, business English, things like that. I edit documents, I help people write things, and I translate from French, Spanish, Italian, Russian, Romanian, and German. Okay, so please follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Goodbye.